When you think about gardening, most people imagine sprawling backyards with lush greenery and enough space to plant anything their heart desires. But what if you don't have that luxury? What if all you've got is a small, cramped apartment with barely enough room to turn around, let alone plant a full-fledged garden? It might surprise you to know that over 80% of people who attempt to grow plants in containers, whether on a small balcony, patio, or windowsill, struggle to keep them alive for more than a few months. The container gardening failure rate is shockingly high, largely due to lack of knowledge, poor plant choices, or inappropriate potting methods. For me, the journey with container gardening wasn't just a casual hobby, it became an agonizing struggle. My name is Sarah, and I'm 35 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've dreamed of being surrounded by beautiful greenery, bright blossoms, and thriving plants. But like many city dwellers, space has always been a problem for me. When I moved into my tiny apartment, the thought of giving up on that dream broke my heart. It felt like I was stuck in a concrete jungle, isolated from nature, with no hope of creating the oasis I desperately craved. It's just a plant, how hard could it be? I used to think. Oh, how wrong I was. I started with high hopes. I'd scroll through Instagram, admiring the immaculate, perfectly curated images of potted plants glowing in the sunlight. There were fiddle-leaf figs taller than people, cascading vines that seemed to stretch endlessly, and colorful blooms that popped in every corner. That was the life I wanted, to be surrounded by plants that would lift my mood, purify my air, and turn my apartment into the sanctuary I needed. So, I went to the local garden center, picked up a few plants I thought were easy, and placed them in decorative containers that looked just right for the aesthetic I had in mind. I could already see the transformation in my head. My tiny balcony would become a haven, a miniature Eden where I could escape the stresses of daily life. But within weeks, my dream began to fall apart. I'll never forget the first sign of trouble. My fiddle-leaf fig, the one plant I had pinned all my hopes on, started turning brown. At first, it was just a few spots here and there, but soon, entire leaves were curling, turning yellow, and dropping off. I remember sitting on my couch, staring at the plant, helpless, as its beauty seemed to fade before my eyes. Why is this happening? What am I doing wrong? I whispered, almost pleading with it to survive. I watered it more, then less, then more again. Nothing worked. It felt like no matter how much I tried, I was only speeding up its death. The same thing happened with the succulent I had placed by the kitchen window. The leaves, once plump and healthy, started shriveling. I couldn't understand it. Succulents were supposed to be resilient, weren't they? Then my herbs, mint, basil, thyme, wilted one by one, their leaves sagging pitifully in their pots as if they were crying out for help I couldn't give. It wasn't just the dying plants that got to me. It was the sheer frustration of not knowing what I was doing wrong. I tried everything. I moved them around, hoping to find the perfect spot. I changed watering schedules, bought fancy fertilizers, and even spent hours researching on gardening forums, trying to troubleshoot the issue. But no matter what I did, things just got worse. Every morning, I dreaded looking at my plants, because I knew I'd find more leaves on the floor, more signs that I had failed. I began to feel as if I was cursed. Every new plant I brought into my home would start its inevitable decline within days. It felt personal, like I wasn't just bad at gardening, I was bad at nurturing life. There was something wrong with me, some defect in my ability to care for anything. I could feel the weight of my failure hanging over me like a dark cloud, suffocating the joy I had once felt. One day, after a particularly rough week at work, I came home and saw that my prized snake plant, one of the hardiest plants known to mankind, was drooping. Its strong, upright leaves were collapsing in on themselves, wilting as if they had simply given up. I stood there, staring at it, feeling something inside me break. I slumped down on the floor next to the plant, tears streaming down my face. It was ridiculous, I knew that. Crying over a plant. It sounded absurd even as I sobbed uncontrollably. But in that moment, the dead leaves felt like a metaphor for everything else in my life. I was failing, not just at gardening, but at everything. My career wasn't where I wanted it to be, my relationships were falling apart, and now, I couldn't even keep a plant alive. Why can't I do anything right? I screamed at the walls, my voice bouncing off the cold, empty space of my apartment. I was surrounded by the ghostly remains of plants that had once been full of life, and it felt like I was staring at my own reflection, wilted, drooping, lifeless. I stopped trying after that. I didn't throw the plants away, but I stopped watering them, stopped moving them to catch the sunlight, stopped hoping they'd recover. They sat there, neglected, dying slowly as the days passed. It was easier not to care, easier to pretend they didn't exist, than to face the constant reminder of my failure. But every time I looked at those pots, once brimming with promise and now filled with decay, I couldn't escape the sadness. They reminded me of the dreams I had for myself, the dreams I had let die because I didn't know how to nurture them. I was trapped in a vicious cycle of guilt and disappointment, unable to find a way out. The plants weren't just plants anymore. They were a reflection of everything I had lost, everything I couldn't achieve. It's hard to describe the loneliness that comes from such a simple failure. It wasn't just about gardening anymore. It was about my sense of self-worth. I felt as though I was incapable of growth, as though every attempt to bring life into my world was doomed from the start. My apartment, which I had once envisioned as a thriving green space, became a graveyard of wilted leaves and broken dreams. I couldn't talk to anyone about it either. When I tried, my friends would laugh it off, saying, "Oh, it's just a plant. You can always get another one." But they didn't understand the depth of the pain I was feeling. It wasn't just about the plants. It was about what they symbolized, the inability to make something grow, to nurture life, to create beauty in a world that felt increasingly bleak. I would stare out the window, watching the sun rise and set, feeling the crushing weight of my failure with every passing day. My plants had become a constant reminder of everything I couldn't control, everything I couldn't fix. And no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, the grief was always there, lurking in the background, waiting to consume me whole. And so I sank deeper into my despair, letting the plants wither away, just as I felt my hope for change slip through my fingers. I felt trapped. Every corner of my apartment, once filled with dreams of a vibrant oasis, now felt like a prison, a place where nothing could grow, least of all me. The days stretched into weeks, and I lived with my dying plants like they were ghosts haunting every corner of my apartment. I stopped hoping, stopped trying, and let the shadows of failure take over my space. But then, something changed. One afternoon, as I was cleaning up around the house, I found an old photo tucked into a drawer. It was a picture of me as a little girl, sitting next to my grandmother in her garden. She had always been so patient with her plants, talking to them like they were her children, tenderly pruning, watering, and nurturing them. The garden was her pride and joy, a sanctuary in the midst of chaos, and I used to spend hours playing there, surrounded by the fragrance of flowers and the rustling of leaves. I hadn't thought about that garden in years. Looking at that picture brought back a flood of memories, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark. It wasn't hope exactly, but something close to it. I realized then that I had been going about this all wrong. I had wanted the end result, a thriving container garden, without understanding the process, without being willing to learn and nurture it the way my grandmother had nurtured her plants. I had been looking for instant gratification, forgetting that real growth takes time, patience, and care. I knew I couldn't keep letting my plants die without trying again, so I made a decision. I wouldn't give up, not yet. But this time, I would approach things differently. I wouldn't try to force my plants to fit into my idea of what a garden should look like. Instead, I would learn what they needed, and I would take things one step at a time. The first step was research. I had clearly been doing something wrong, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So, I started reading. I spent hours online, reading articles, watching videos, and joining gardening forums. The more I read, the more I realized that I had been making a lot of rookie mistakes. For one, I had been overwatering some plants and underwatering others. I had also chosen plants that weren't suitable for the light conditions in my apartment. I had picked decorative pots without considering the importance of drainage. And perhaps most importantly, I had been ignoring the crucial role of soil health. Once I understood what I had done wrong, I started making changes, small, manageable ones. I repotted my surviving plants into containers with proper drainage, and I invested in high-quality potting soil that was suited to the specific needs of each plant. I also moved some of them to spots where they would get the right amount of light, whether it was in direct sunlight, by the kitchen window, or full sun on the balcony. I also realized that container gardening wasn't about throwing plants into pretty pots and hoping for the best. It was about creating a small ecosystem within each pot. The soil, water, sunlight, and even the type of container all had to work together. It was like a puzzle, and once I figured out how to put the pieces together, things started to change. I didn't expect miracles overnight. In fact, I didn't expect much at all. But slowly, over the next few weeks, I started to see signs of life. The first leaf that sprouted on my snake plant felt like a tiny victory. The basil, which I had assumed was a lost cause, began to perk up, its leaves becoming fuller and greener. Even the fiddle-leaf fig showed new growth, tiny leaves that gave me hope that it might survive after all. As I nurtured my plants back to life, I realized I was nurturing myself too. The process was therapeutic. It gave me something to focus on, something to care for. Each morning, I would check on my plants, water the ones that needed it, and rotate the pots so they would get even sunlight. It became part of my routine, and the more time I spent caring for my plants, the more I felt a sense of peace returning to my life. But the most important lesson I learned was that thriving plants, much like anything worth having in life, require consistency. You can't neglect them for days and expect them to flourish. You have to show up every day, even when you don't feel like it. You have to tend to them, give them what they need, and trust that, in time, they will grow. That's not to say it was all smooth sailing. There were still setbacks, plants that didn't make it, days when I overwatered out of fear that I was neglecting them, and moments of doubt, when I thought I would never get it right. But each time, I reminded myself that this was a process, and processes take time. I wasn't just learning to grow plants. I was learning to be patient with myself. It wasn't long before I started to notice something else too. As my plants began to thrive, my apartment felt different. It wasn't just a space to live in anymore, it was becoming a home. The greenery brought a sense of life and energy that I hadn't realized I was missing. The air felt fresher, and the space looked brighter. It was amazing how something as simple as a few healthy plants could transform the entire atmosphere of a place. But I didn't do it alone. There were moments when I hit roadblocks, unsure of what to do next. That's when I reached out for help. I connected with local gardening groups, sought advice from seasoned container gardeners, and leaned on the community I found online. It turned out that I wasn't the only one who had struggled with container gardening. Hearing other people's stories of trial and error made me feel less alone, and their successes inspired me to keep going. And then, something incredible happened. As I continued to learn and apply new techniques, my plants not only survived, they flourished. My tiny balcony became the sanctuary I had dreamed of, filled with lush greenery and vibrant colors. The fiddle-leaf fig, once on the brink of death, now stood tall, its leaves broad and healthy. My herb garden thrived, giving me fresh basil, mint, and thyme whenever I needed it. Even my succulents, which I had almost given up on, grew plump and full of life. I can't describe the sense of accomplishment I felt. It was more than just pride in my plants, it was pride in myself. I had taken something that I had once considered a failure and turned it into a success. I had learned, grown, and most importantly, I had persevered. That's when I stumbled upon a game-changing resource, the book Container Capers, Creative Ideas for Thriving Potted Plants. If there's one thing that truly transformed my approach to container gardening, it was this book. It broke down everything I needed to know in simple, practical terms, exactly what I had been searching for. From how to choose the right plants for different light conditions to the importance of proper drainage and soil, it covered all the essentials I had been missing. The best part? It wasn't just a technical manual. It offered creative ideas for making the most out of small spaces, showing me how to turn even the tiniest of balconies into a green oasis. If you're struggling with container gardening like I was, trust me, this book is a lifesaver. It took my gardening to a whole new level, helping me overcome the challenges I had faced and giving me the confidence to keep growing, both in my garden and in my life. You can get your own digital copy at libraifi.com, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to create their own thriving potted garden. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this content a like, and share it with anyone you know who might be struggling with their plants. Every gardener deserves the chance to thrive, and sometimes, all it takes is the right guidance.